For this next unit for law and policy, we're talking about what I call the DNA of environmental policy. The purpose of this is to help you decipher the different policy documents that we're going to read over the course of the next semester. Some of those documents look a little bit funny. They're not written in language that we're used to using. They've got some numeric codes that we're not used to using. And so this is going to break down how those policies are written and what the different sections of those policies are. So you'll notice that on Moodle, I have put an Adobe Spark poster or an infographic titled Unit 4, the DNA of Environmental Policy, and it focuses on the Wilderness Act. We're going to use the Wilderness Act as our example for this exercise. And we'll look at the different sections of the Wilderness Act and we'll decipher what's in those sections. And then hopefully you're able to apply how we read the Wilderness Act to the other policies that we read over the course of the semester. This is the infographic that explains the DNA of environmental policy and uses the Wilderness Act of 1964 as its example. You can see the different components of a policy are there in red, and there are some quotations from the Wilderness Act in gray that exemplify those different components. So each of the different policies that we will read this semester, including the Wilderness Act, they usually have 6 different components to them. And those are the preamble, the definition section, the statutes, the monitoring section, the enforcement section, and the amendments section. I'll break down the main idea of each of those different parts of the policy, and then we'll look for examples in the Wilderness Act. For our example today, we are using the Wilderness Act as it is found on wilderness.net, and I want to give you a little orientation to some of the nomenclature that you see on this front page. The first thing that you notice is that you've got the Wilderness Act, and then you see 16 USC 1131-1136. That is the section and chapter of the U.S. Code where the Wilderness Act can be found. Section 16 of the U.S. Code are those that pertain to conservation policies, like those that pertain to the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, Wilderness and Department of Interior. Our biodiversity-focused policies are included in Section 16 of the Code. Many other environmental policies are included in Section 42. Often this is where you find those that pertain to human health and the environment and are implemented by the Environmental Protection Agency. The preamble to a policy is the language up at the very front of the policy. Usually it's written in Section 1 or 2, and it is a grand statement of the need for the policy and the values and the ethics and objectives that underlie that policy. It's usually written in very broad, sometimes even poetic language that we're not used to seeing or associating with policy documents, and the preambles are often difficult to disagree with. They're broad statements of values and ethics. The preamble of the Wilderness Act begins in Section 2A, and it reads, "In order to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States and its possessions, leaving no land designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition, it is hereby declared to be the policy of the Congress to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefits and an enduring resource of wilderness." That's a pretty strong statement of ethics and values related to why we think wilderness is important in the United States. There are hints of ecocentrism there, hints of biocentrism, maybe some social ecology when we start talking about the risk of over-mechanization and leaving no land designated for preservation. But those are poetic and lyrical words that we don't often think about in policy documents. The second component of the policies that we will read are the definitions, and the definition section is a bit like a glossary. It's usually up near the front end of the policy, and it's usually its own section, and it just includes unusual words or difficult words or what are called legal terms of art. These are words that have very specific meaning within the field of law, and very specific definitions about how they apply. So there's usually a definition section that outlines those words that require very specific definitions. Sometimes there's scientific words that need to be defined. There's only one term defined in the definitions section of the Wilderness Act, which is Section 2C. A wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. The definition is important because that's what will be debated in a court of law. If citizens of the United States take the Department of Interior to court for violating the terms of the Wilderness Act, the court is going to have to decide what it means for a wilderness area to be untrammeled by man, and what does it mean for man himself to be a visitor who does not remain. And does the impact on the wilderness area constitute trammeling or remaining an ongoing impact from visitors? The third component of a policy are the statutes themselves. And these are the different rules or requirements or regulations that are embedded in the policy. This is where like the rubber hits the road. This is the stuff that the policy actually does, the way it is designed to influence behavior. Next, we get to Section 3 of the Wilderness Act. This begins the statutes, the actual terms of the act that dictate how the act will be implemented and how we have to behave in wilderness areas. It contains portions that describe what kinds of activities are allowed and what are prohibited in wilderness areas. The first statutes of the Wilderness Act, Section 3A and 3B, describe how new wilderness areas will be added to the system and what happens to wilderness areas that had been designated before the Wilderness Act was put in place. Wilderness areas are recommended by the President to Congress, and Congress then determines if those areas meet the definition of wilderness and are added to the wilderness system. Section 4 describes the uses of wilderness areas. Section 4A, 1, 2, and 3 describe how wilderness areas will relate to other federal lands around them, like national park lands. And then when we get down to Section 4B, we get the uses of wilderness. They will be devoted to public purposes of recreation, scenic and scientific and educational and conservation uses. Wilderness areas are our strongest level of land conservation in the U.S. federal system. Uses are limited only to those that are listed here in Section 4A, followed up by a section that describes the prohibition on other uses. The prohibition here, Section 4C, says that except as specifically provided for in this Act and subject to existing private rights, there shall be no commercial enterprise and no permanent road within a wilderness area. That's a pretty strict level of conservation. It says no motorized equipment or motorboats, no landing of aircraft, no other forms of mechanical transport, and no structures. There were some uses that were grandfathered into wilderness areas. So there were some mining and some timber claims that occurred in what were wilderness lands before the designation of the Wilderness Act, and those were grandfathered in. Some of those activities were still allowed once the Wilderness Act was in place, but those activities sunset and those activities slowly fade out and then are no longer allowed. Next, most policies have a monitoring component, and this is how the success or the effectiveness of the policy is to be monitored by the government over time so that future elected officials or future decision makers know whether or not the policy is achieving its goal and can revise or amend the policy. The closest thing that we have to a monitoring component in the Wilderness Act is Section 7, which is the annual reporting section, which just states that at the beginning of each session of Congress, the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior, who manage the wilderness areas of the United States, shall prepare a report for the President and Congress about the state of wilderness. Many of the policies that we look at will have an enforcement section. This describes what happens if an individual or an organization, could be a factory, is out of compliance with the policy, it might describe fines or it might describe criminal offenses. But it describes how we know if people are breaking the rules, they're out of compliance, and what the different penalties for that might be. And then the final section of many of the policies is the amendments component. This is the section of the policy that describes how that policy is to be revised over time. It often goes along with the monitoring component. So we have a monitoring component that describes how we know if the policy is being effective, and then we've got a statement of how the policy is revised and on what schedule it might be revised. Some of our policies are to be revisited on a set number of years, or when certain events happen, or they have a sunset clause where the policy ends and it needs to be re-voted upon by an act of Congress in order to be re-upped. So that's the amendment clause. The Wilderness Act itself does not have an enforcement section. It's not the kind of act that requires inspection by the federal government and compliance by permit holders or something like that. So that section isn't really found here. It does have some amendments at the end, but it doesn't have an amendment section that describes the process of making amendments. It just lists some amendments that have been made over time through the legislative process, one of which is the termination of the 10-year reporting requirement. So again, just to summarize, there are 6 parts to the DNA of environmental policy. They are the preamble, the definitions, the statutes, the enforcement component, the monitoring component, and amendments. And we will see most of those in the policies we read. As we saw in the Wilderness Act, we don't see them all clearly in that policy. But most of the other policies we read will have some hint of those 6 components of environmental policy.